speak on the issue of credible elections and national security. As we are approaching the 2027 elections, when Mike called me for this engagement, I was hesitant because, as I've said elsewhere, I basically have put my television on Chinese station for the past 2 years. I watch the Chinese station. Not because I hear what they say, but because I have been so frustrated that after spending 30 years of my life, 10 years of being involved in the election process in our country, every 4 years we are called upon to go back to the same debate about credible election, transparency, fairness. When are we going to end this debate? But having regard to the fact that even in the United States of America, the fourth governor of New York, when democracy was a big challenge, he made the point that the ill of democracy can only be cured by more democracy. And that is why I called Mike and look, I have reflected. I'll be part of these efforts. Because, as the chairman noted, election success, to achieve credible election, is a multi-stakeholder responsibility. And so, for us as a people and as a nation, just as in 2016, when in Ghana, there was fear that Ghana was going to regress, when we had left office, ECOWAS nominated Professor Jega and other people from the US, IROI and NDI, put together by United States government. And I got a call to also be part and be a resource person to meet with leaders in Ghana. The late Kofi Annan, when we were in his home, he said, Nigerians, you are supposed to be leading us. But today, that's not what is happening. And that we have not been invited because of the fear in Ghana, because there was problem, there was fear. The current president, Mahama, was the one in office at that time. And so there was desperation. America was very concerned because they have so much interest given what has been going on in Ghana, and they want it to be sustained. Kofi Annan, at the meeting we had, he said, gentlemen, building democracy is a complex process. That the elections are only the first stage. But if their credibility are undermined, so also the legitimacy of democracy. And that underscored the importance of legitimacy, referenced by the chairman. A public perception that people who are in office, they are there on the basis that they were voted in, they were voted in. Please, may I first confirm, are we covered by the Chatham House rule in this meeting today? Because after all, the definition of democracy that we all parrot every time, the government of the people, by the people and for the people, was not a classroom product. It was a speech. It was a paragraph that was taken from Abraham Lincoln's speech when he went to dedicate the cemetery, a funeral oration on account of the death of 7,000 United States soldiers, 44,000 wounded, precisely on the 19th of November, 1863, at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, where he said that all those who have died, they should not die in vain, that under God, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish under the earth. That's where they distilled the idea, definition that we'll talk about today, of democracy. And so, the whole essence of democracy is essentially because it brings about participation and accountability to the process of human development. But because of the compounding complexity of society, it is impossible to gather all Nigerians to have what we call direct democracy. That's what gave birth to the idea of representative democracy, in which case, on periodic basis, the people of the country will give part of their sovereignty to a body of persons to represent them, to govern public affairs. That's what the whole idea. And so, the Nigerian Constitution itself, under Chapter 2, the fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy. Section 14, subsection 2A, very clear, that sovereignty belongs to the Nigerian people, from whom individuals or government derive all powers and authority. And that brings about the importance of regular, predictable elections that represent the liberal dimension of the liberal democracy, where people of a society, of a country, have the opportunity to renew, to extend, to reject, or elect people who will lead them. Now, the conduct of election, as referenced by the chairman, is a very complex process. It's an all-involving process that nations embark on in peacetime, because it has implication. Its credibility, its outcomes have implication for stability and sustainability of democracy itself. Given our own historical past, we all recall what happened in the First Republic, that it was the absence of credible election, absence of good elections, that led to the crisis of the First Republic. That again re-emerged in 1983 with what happened in Southwest, 1965, the Western Region crisis. As a young man, I remember a renowned publisher from Ondo State, where I partly grew up, Bagbe, he was killed. And so, the credibility of election is very key, because what rekindles hope and confidence in the ballot is a credible election, wherein the people believe that those who are exercising authority, exercising power, are exercised on behalf of them based on the fact that they have been granted two critical factors, which are authorization and accountability. But where that is lacking, what you have is a problem. And so, as you find what happened in Kenya in 2007 and 2008, we all remember what happened in Kenya. And so many other societies where failed elections led to society destroyed, people killed, violence, property destroyed. Around the globe, we have seen that happen, particularly in African region. We've had our first share, the First Republic, Second Republic, and that is what we must not allow to happen. Because we have seen people who are contented, thriving people, who have now found themselves homeless and hopeless in IDP camps, and many on forced migration on account of failed election. And that is why the decision by the alumni body to pick this topic at this critical moment is so important. And I'm so delighted to see that both the parliament, the executive, and the judiciary, we are represented here today. And so the question we should now ask ourselves, what are the indicia, what are the metrics for determining credible elections? Broadly speaking, globally, there are two broad metrics. First is what we call process indicators. Under process indicators, then two, we have outcome indicators. Process indicator will determine the level of participation, whether there was competition, and whether there was outcome. Then the outcome indicators will also show whether if the vote actually reflected the will of the people, and if there's a post-election adjudication, has that been properly determined by the court of law? We'll come to that issue of court of law. That's my constituency. I am worried of the expanding empire of the courts in determining who becomes the winner of election in our country. The winner of election must be determined finally and conclusively at the polling unit and not in the court of law. There are a few lessons to learn from the United Kingdom. Now, other process indicators, because there are three phases of elections. The pre-election stage, this is where we are at the moment. Then the election itself, then post-election. The pre-election phase where we are right now is so critical because if election will be peaceful, you will see from the process of planning. In terms of what happened with political party primary, first it starts with registration. But thank God, we'll come to that. By the time we came on board, in 2010, there were things that we have done that ordinarily, the moment, because election rigging, manipulation, starts with voter registration. That is where the process starts. But we have never, since politicians have learned to fly without perishing, the commission was able to develop process and procedure without also missing. And that's what we did to deal with that aspect of pre-election crisis. But where we are right now is the pre-election stage. The first thing you must know, we must ask whether election will be credible, will be the legal framework. What is the legal framework that will govern the election? The sanctity of law is very key to election management. Just as we talk about the perception, because perception is very key. Whether those who are managing the elections, whether other critical stakeholders are neutral, they are impartial, they are professional. It's very key. In fact, 70% of election management is about perception. If we get the perception wrong, we are in trouble in terms of our actions or inaction. So the legal framework, very key. And number two is the issue about existence of a credible register, which the commission has successfully achieved. Then, but far important is the fact that, and I wanted to put something on the board. There's a pyramid I'm going to show to you on the board to demonstrate to you for the 10 years we were in office, just like the chairman and the commissioners. On the day of election, they are only going to be mere supervisors of election because elections really are conducted by the rest of Nigerians. And I will show something, you should put something on the board to demonstrate that to you. And so that even assuming without conceding that everybody in INEC is bad, the question now is, yes, there's a pyramid. Now, if you look at this pyramid, so that we can speak to it, you have the Chief Electoral Officer, which is the Professor Joash, at the top. Everything is planning right now. At some point, they will move them to the states, INEC state offices. At the INEC state offices is an exchange of baton. The commissioner and his staff at the head office will take everything to the local governments. From the local government, we have the SPO down to the base. They are Nigerians who are not part of INEC process and procedures, who were basically recruited barely a week before elections. They are the one, because the moment you hand over the ballot paper, the result sheet, and all that thing to, at best, SPOs. If I SPO, they also take it from other federal agencies. From that stage down to the bottom, they are Nigerians. Because the chairman of INEC, the REC, the EO, on the election day cannot sign any document on election day. They are only supervisors. This is where your job, our job, becomes very critical. Strong supervision. And that is why, as I drive down, is the provision of Section 134 of the 2022 Electoral Act that some of us addressed the press in 2022 have been again repeated in the 2026 Electoral Act, which says that any omission by SPO, work election officers, presiding officers, that is contrary, that is not contrary to the Electoral Act, can be ignored. That is to say that every instruction, directive given by INEC to all of these categories of staff will not lead to the violation of election. That is why election rigging is very rampant, because they are aware of this. I'm going to show some other provisions. And so, to have such a provision repeated against Section 134 is a tragedy. The 2022 Electoral Act represents the most progressive piece of electoral legislation in our history. Regrettably, that has been watered down by the 2026 Electoral Act. I speak today not from theoretical point of view, as someone who spent 10 years, and I basically crisscrossed the entire country conducting election, having practical experience on the basis of which some of these things were done. Now, with respect to the outcome indicators, here we have programmed our election to be going to the courts. We have learned nothing from the United Kingdom. For a period of 99 years until 2010, there had never been a post-electoral education in the United Kingdom. Even the UK that introduced Nigeria into election rigging. There's none until 2010, when the Liberal Democrats had issue which was taken to the court. This was because of their own peculiar experience. Because the United Kingdom and America were the most notorious country for vote buying in the 18th century. And so it took, at that time, the court in England was not to entertain election petition because politicians were buying everybody in England. And the fear was that the court of law will be captured. They will take over the court. And at the moment the court is captured, democracy is in danger. Because what gives viability to democracy is the rule of law. The only arm to which all must bow must be judiciary. But the moment the judiciary shows sign of collapse, weakness, irrelevance, or succumb to the intimidating and suffocating influence of corrupt politicians, democracy is in peril. And that is why ab initio in England, they don't attend it. Because all petition goes to the parliament. But because of the fact that in parliament, there was no electoral justice, it came to a point where it was agreed that, look, you know what? The court should now attend to election petition in England. And the idea was that they decided deliberately to protect the judiciary, was that every election law must be interpreted purposefully, strictly. And that's why in England, politicians are afraid of judges. They are afraid of the court. But in Nigeria, those who will rig election, those who will manipulate, and they won't tell you to go to court, they have no regard for my constituency anymore. That's a lesson you must learn from England. You can try that in the United Kingdom. And so that is what you find with respect to process indicator and outcome indicator. Now, the whole embrace of democracy is essentially because it brings about participation and accountability to the process of human development. In fact, it makes possible the reality of the law of anticipated reaction in election management, which says that what has controlling effect in a politician in public office is not about the last election, but the fear of the next election. But where, either through the law or the process, politicians now feel that they don't need the vote of the people, the fear of the people will no longer be there. And that is why in United Kingdom, other jurisdictions, public opinion is so critical in sustaining their democracy. But right here, public opinion is gone. And so, we must know that achieving credible election requires multi-stakeholder responsibility. Or the following key stakeholders. You have the INEC at the top, saddled with responsibility to midwife democratic competition. Number two, you have the judiciary. And number three, you have the security agencies. And I'm happy that many of you who are here today, and the latter part of this my lecture, you will see how our effort over time have ensured that you play your role impartially and professionally as security agent and all that. Then, of course, political party, candidates, the civil society, voter, and the media. But the truth of the matter is that the trinity of INEC, Judiciary, and security will address Nigerian electoral issues. The trinity of these three key stakeholders can resolve most of our problems. Because once the umpire stands tall and mighty in defense of the process, by not allowing himself, either as a presiding officer, assistant presiding officer, all the levels I have identified, do not see themselves as an errant people, because an umpire must not be an errant person. You must stand for the national interests. You must not surrender the core values of impartiality, of neutrality, and professionalism that must underscore your work. But once all that are undermined, then of course, you are not likely to have a credible election. Now, with respect to the sanctity of law, public trust, which is almost gone in our country today, because once that distrust is there, no matter what you do as an umpire, no matter what you do as a security agent, no matter what you do as other key stakeholders, the people will not take you seriously. And that is why our actions, our words, our action, in our inactions, the things we do or fail to do, we must maintain the highest principle of ethical standards. And where those who have been called upon to keep public trust are failed to do so, then of course, certain actions must be taken. Fundamentally, there are three principal frameworks that govern election in Nigeria. The Constitution. Section 160, INEC as a body is a creation of the Constitution. The Constitution, the Electoral Act, regulations and guidelines made pursuant to Section 160 of the Constitution, as well as Section 148 of the Electoral Act. These are the principal laws that govern the conduct of election. In 2010, why I said I feel frustrated about our country, when we came on board under the Jega leadership, we had done advocacy for the right thing in our country for over 20 years. And so when we're now given opportunity, after all, I turned that offer ab initio. It was the former Vice President, late Mike Igini, who placed a call to me that you cannot reject this type of assignment. You have been advocating. Come and do the job. Join your boss in ASU. I was president of Student Union in my time. And we came on board. When we came on board, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing we did was to identify election rigging provision in our act. Do you know that there was even in the 2010, the previous 2002 Electoral Act, there were provisions for the use of thugs in our laws. There were provisions for the use of thugs that were put in there. When lawmakers now make law to protect their own interests because they are in office. And so when we came in, we identified Section 49. What does Section 49 says? It says that a presiding officer at a polling unit, once a voter comes before him, if he's satisfied, that's language, if he's satisfied that is the person, he issues him ballot paper to vote. That's what led to massive rigging. Remember, we're doing manual register. They just write with the biro and all that. Section 53, with respect to determining, overvoting, it was based on total number of registered voters. That was used to rig elections. Then, of course, you have Section 68 of the Act, which says that all these categories of persons that are shown on that pyramid, that the decision of a returning officer shall be final, only subject to the court. So from day one, All the politicians needed to do was to go and buy returning officer. You remember in 2019, returning officers were hiding from one place to the other. They will appear, disappear, and so on and so forth. That's what they were doing because they knew that INEC had no longer control anymore. It must go to the court. Ladies and gentlemen, it took us 20 years to persuade the National Assembly to remove these provisions. And that happened in 2022. Remember that before the 2022 Act was reluctantly signed, it will be rejected 4 times. Do you all remember that? It was rejected. And it was eventually signed. So you now have Section 47, which is a new one, again from 49. We now have Section 51, and we now have Section 65, which says that where the return has been made out of due process, administratively, INEC as a regulator of elections in Nigeria had the power administratively to review it without having to go to court. That is Section 65 we now have. All of these things were done to give meaning and purpose to the ballot as the best means of the expression of the will of the people in democracy. The basic issue that had to do with credible election had to do with these processes that I've outlined. And that's why I spent little time to explain to Nigerians that, look, recall, we came in to deal with that Section 49. We have to do separate voting, separate time for accreditation, and separate time for voting. You all remember what happened in 2011. Then from there, we migrated to the smart card reader in 2015. And in 2015, to tell you that as INEC is planning, politicians are also planning, try to look at the process, how to going to bypass the process. In 2015, we now said, look, we need to identify people having successfully, because Jega leadership was the first who successful, no, we didn't start it, but the very first successful compilation of biometric register was done under the Jega leadership. And we are part of that effort. Now, it was now decided that we need to confirm your fingerprint. That was the idea of Carida. Carida was now introduced. For the purpose of inclusivity, ladies and gentlemen, we knew that there were some Nigerians who have issues with their fingers. We now decided to have an application in the Carida to take into account those who don't have fingers. Ladies and gentlemen, the presiding officer we trained, they went to various communities. Suddenly, the whole community no longer have fingers. They were now using that application. The whole community, no fingers anymore. These were the things that he did to undermine the credibility of the electoral process in our country. And that is why the sanctity of the law will normally generate interest. You all recall, Nigerians, irrespective of what happened with respect to the transmission of the result, that public trust, public confidence was at the highest level in this country before the 2023 election. Is that not correct? Many Nigerians were returning back. I left office in 2022, but I offered myself not to take any appointment for any consultancy with anybody. And I called John Momo. I called the Duke of Delta, Duke of Abakwena. Let Dr. say, I need your platform. I don't want to do consultancy for anybody, but to educate Nigerians on sound knowledge of what the reforms that we have put in place. Because I cannot be part of those who have put this reform in place when it comes to implementation because of huge consultancy money to go and join a party. I refuse that. And that's what we try to do, to give meaning and purpose to the ballot as the best means of the expression of the will of the people. Ladies and gentlemen, the current amendment to the Electoral Act, where they have now basically dealt with so many provisions, is a tragedy to our country. It's a big tragedy. It's a regression from the threshold that we have crossed, and I will point them out here. And that's why I feel sad for our country, that every election year we are discussing the same issue. We forgot that election is just a process. The ultimate goal is development. But we seem to be stuck in the issue of elections. That appears to be where we are at the moment. And so when you have a proviso, which of course was brought about regrettably by my constituency, I made the point. If Nigeria will die, it will die because of we lawyers. They will die because of we lawyers. Both the bar and the bench. Both the bar and the bench. Because Section 160 in 2010 when we came on board subjected INEC to the control of the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. we wrote a memo to Mr. President Goodluck Jonathan, whose victory for due process and democracy was very clear. It was Jonathan that, look, we need an unfettered freedom for our democracy to survive. Jonathan initiated the process for the first alteration of Section 160. We stated clearly that of all the executive bodies established under Section 153, with respect to the Independent National Electoral Commission, its powers to make regulation and determine its own procedure shall not be subject to the direction or control of the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. That was what Jonathan did and gave us freedom. Secondly, 48 hours to the election, Section 52, subsection 2 of the 2010 Act that expressly prohibited the use of electronic system in our elections. In order to give room for the use of the carrier, President Jonathan assented to it 48 hours before that election. Those were the things that we put in place as safeguards to make our democracy work. It's a student that have paid exam that should be repeating exams. I'll be asked to repeat the exam now by discussing these things that we have discussed before, because they are there. Look at what happened to Section 77 of the current Act. You cannot spend precious legislative time in going to an area that will be covered by the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria where you have zero competence. Who can contest election? Under Section 65 of the Constitution, qualification, Section 131 with respect to the President, Section 177 with respect to the Governor. All the subsections, C, were clear of the Constitution to the effect that you must belong to a political party and be sponsored by that political party. So the amendment to say that you should go out to determine the time within which you can be a member is unconstitutional. If people got Section 40, go and look at it. It's very clear. You freedom of association, you can belong to any political party. You cannot regulate the political party in a manner that will regulate them out of existence. After all, look at Democratic Party here in America. Democratic Party was formed in 1828. It is today 198 years as a political party. Republican was formed in 1854. It's today 172 years. We must recognize that political parties are the essential organs of the democratic process. They are indeed, without these parties, in fact, modern representative democracy is inconceivable. So, the role of law enforcement agencies. The Constitution is very clear and good enough. Some of the provisions of the Act have also said clearly the role of security agencies. We have just entered the season of intolerance at the moment. Once we enter election period, it's a season of intolerance, where there's total disregard for the rule of law, the right of opponent, as we have seen over time. I recall in 2015 in Benin, where I served my last time in office, where a powerful politician declared in Edo State that they were going to use the federal might in Edo State. And I addressed the press conference. I called our chairman. In fact, he called. Have you read what so person said? I said, yes. I read the press conference, and I was clear to them that, look, under our watch, under my watch in Edo State, it is the will of the people through the ballot that will determine who becomes what, and not the federal might. That it is the might of the people through the ballot that will speak loud and clear. And so we have entered a state of intolerance at the moment. Security agencies, you have a role. That's why I talk about the trinity of INEC, Judiciary, and security. Your job is to create an enabling environment that will enable Nigerians to go out to vote on election day, to allow for two important crucial factors, which are authorization, that the people who are going to office are authorized to go there. It is when there's an authorization that there's a basis for accountability. Where there's no authorization, there will be no accountability. And so it is your duty to do so. Interestingly enough, the 2022 Electoral Act, as well as the 2026 Section 95, Section 97, Section 99, all of these sections are very clear that no political party or candidate shall be prevented from holding rallies. None should be prevented from holding rallies. and specifically enjoin commissioners of police. Commissioners of police, you cannot be talking about public order, write a letter for permission. No. Public institutions like civic centers, stadia, television, all of those property belong to the Nigerian people. Whether you are at the state level or at the federal level, they belong to Nigerians. And the law says that they must all be given access to use them. And in any case, with respect to the issue about venue, the principle of first come, first serve. And that what the police required to do, according to the law, is to provide adequate security, one. Number two, in a consultative manner, and not to prevent people from holding elections. As I conclude, may I say this here, that all over the world, the conduct of elections is supposed to be a civil, particularly in the Western world, even in our neighboring country. On election, the people go about their normal business. But the task in our country has been a very difficult one. But we must recognize that we all must participate, because our failure to recognize the primacy or centrality of policies and political processes has been our greatest undoing. Because no nation, no society can make progress outside the value orientation or competence of those who sit on the round table of political discussion. And that is why it's very important, irrespective of how we feel, we have a duty to come out to ensure that we all participate in this election. And so, I must say this, finally, that credible election is what gives life to the sustenance of democracy. Democracy is what also gives hope for the people. And it must be borne in mind that democracy cannot thrive in the soil of absolutism. Democracy can only survive where the rule of law flourishes. Because it is rule of law that gives viability to the practice of democracy. Without the rule of law, society and democratic practice will be nothing but the coming together of the most set of people, the most vicious, whose whims and caprices will prevail. This must not be allowed to happen in our country. We must not surrender, compromise the value of integrity. This is very key, because today, outside the country, most of our people are not respected because of the fact of the way they feel that elections are conducted. Democracy is like an orchestra. The sound do not blend, it do not melt. It's a symphony, it's not a concerto. The sound of democracy, like an orchestra, its melody depends on the unique sound that different instruments bring to the entire melodious whole. All of us who have a role to play, we must stand tall, and particularly my constituency, because in the final analysis, the best elections, or the best laws or best processes around the world will not give you election if we don't have men and women of integrity who will call justice by its own name to do the right thing for our country. The winner of election must be determined, finally and conclusively, at the court. And so the sound of democracy is a sound that will never stop at playing, because the broad outline of the 21st century is clear. It offers opportunity for people who can live together, who can work together, and give not only to themselves, but for future generations, whose faces we are yet to see, whose name we may never know. All of whom should be able to say that indeed we left behind a heritage of a credible democratic framework for our country. Thank you.
I do not know whether a standing ovation is in order. I don't know. I'm just asking. Thank you. Thank you very much, Barrister Mike Igini. Thank you for taking us on the tour de force. Please, we can resume.